In 1227, when Genghis Khan had shattered all the rules and brought the world to its knees, he died. But what if I told you that his death was even more brutal than his conquests? Most people think the great conqueror simply died of natural causes, but that is far from the truth. Genghis Khan's death was not just the end of his life, but the beginning of an even greater struggle, for power, for his legacy, and even to erase him from memory. We are accustomed to seeing the death of great leaders as a grand act, but the truth about Genghis Khan's death may shock you to your core. What really happened when the mighty warrior died, and his empire began to crumble? Let's unravel the dark secrets that have been hidden from everyone. Genghis Khan, feared and respected even after centuries, fell into a trap not just of war, but of his own body. Stricken by the severe diseases that ravaged his body, he was forced to fight not only his enemies, but also himself. His empire thrived under the rule of the invincible leader, but this great general could not escape the death brought on by illness. In his final days, he could no longer wield his sword, could no longer move as he once did, and even his immense physical strength faded as he began to lose the ability to walk. Genghis Khan's legs grew weak and failed, as if a heavy illness had broken his legendary courage. His hands, once invincible, now barely held a staff. The body of the great conqueror was riddled with festering wounds and weakness. Doctors who saw him tried to help with all their remaining strength, but even their most powerful treatments, including the best medical knowledge of the time, could not prevent the inevitable. Genghis Khan was not ready to give up, but what was happening to his body made him feel a strange relief that he no longer had to rule the empire that had been his life. Yet, even in his state of physical weakness, Genghis Khan continued to command, still attempting to issue orders despite his frailty. The legends of his indomitable will were not exaggerations. In his final days, he acted as a political manipulator, despite the illness that made him feel every inch of his body. But this struggle was no longer a battle with enemies. It was a battle for control over his own death, over his own legacy. Every command, every word from him was like the last effort not to let himself break completely. Intrigue and politics began to consume his last remaining strength. His chosen rulers, selected to manage the empire after his death, sensed that the death of the great leader could change the course of history. He was dying, yet continued to leave his mark on politics, society, and even in the hearts of his subjects. His face, once a symbol of strength, now became pale and sickly, leaving only echoes of greatness in the empire he built. Genghis Khan knew that his empire, just like his body, was falling apart. But even in the face of death, unwilling to show weakness, he continued to search for ways to maintain control. Before his eyes, the empire began to die with him, and he relentlessly tried to hold on to it, as if he could not accept that his time had run out. In this moment, his physical decline and moral decay became key elements in this final game, which led to the disappearance of Genghis Khan as a symbol of strength. Genghis Khan was never ready for moderation or weakness. He wanted to die as he lived, with great power and grandeur. But reality was cruel. His empire, like his health, couldn't withstand the pressure of time and inevitability. And in those final moments, as he tried to manipulate even his own body, he realized he could not escape his death. It was a moment when the empire slowly slipped from its ruler's grasp, and only his last decisions, his final commands, left a mark on history. As a result, even in his last battle, Genghis Khan remained the only one who could control his death, as he had controlled his conquests. His physical and moral collapse was undeniable, but his determination left no doubt. Even in his mortal weakness, he was still at the center of world politics. His legacy, in one way or another, survived his death and became a symbol that reflected both the strength and cruelty of his vast empire. At the time of Genghis Khan's death, his palace was boiling with political intrigue. He had long ceased to be the invincible conqueror who ruled the massive empire single-handedly. With his death came the final struggle for power among his sons and closest advisors. And while his body was gradually decaying from the severe illness, it was impossible to ignore that every movement, every command from him, was part of a carefully orchestrated scenario to solidify his legacy. Was it merely a painful end, or a shocking political manipulation? It seemed that the death of the great Genghis Khan should have been an epical event, the end of his grand conquests. But what if I told you that the death of this monarch was just another part of a manipulation? All these years he had avoided the inevitability of old age and illness, using politics and strategies to preserve his power. His enemies, such as relatives and even some advisors, were ready to exploit every weak moment to invade the empire and redistribute the power. At the moment when Genghis Khan felt the approach of his death, he made one final attempt to decide who would be the next ruler of the empire. Most historians believe his last command was related to the appointment of a successor. But was it really that simple? Could his final act have been part of a very cunning political game to determine the empire's fate? Legends say that after Genghis Khan's death, his son, Tolui, was appointed regent. But what if this was not the dying emperor's will? What if behind his final commands lay even darker and more manipulative games? Perhaps Genghis Khan, on the brink of death, was ready to pass on power not just to hand over control, but to use his sons as puppets in a battle for the throne. After all, he likely knew he could not escape death, but he could create a unique mechanism to maintain his political control even as his empire began to crumble. As rumors spread about Genghis Khan's condition, his enemies and even his subjects began to act. Could one of his advisors or sons, wanting to conceal the horrific truth about his illness, have ordered his death before it would occur naturally? Some claim that Genghis Khan no longer had the strength to suppress his own intentions, and it was this very weakness that allowed others to seize the throne. So, could it be that his death was not merely the result of illness, but part of a political conspiracy? Genghis Khan's death caused an immense worldwide stir, and his empire began to disintegrate just weeks after his frail body left its final mark on history. But what really happened? Was his departure from life the perfect conclusion to a grand political game? It's impossible to ignore the fact that at this moment Genghis Khan did everything possible to ensure his legacy lived on long after his death. Was this the right move? Or did he leave behind not only power, but an entire web of manipulation? What happened after his death is another part of this shocking story. All these accusations and manipulations were not coincidental. Genghis Khan perhaps did die, but his ideas lived on in those willing to pursue their goals in his shadow. Could this have been the genius final move of a great general who not only conquered worlds, but also manipulated those left behind? When Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, it seemed his vast empire, stretching from China to Europe, was left in the hands of his descendants. However, what his sons and closest allies observed was far from a peaceful transition of power. The death of the great conqueror marked the beginning of a new phase, one that unfolded in the shadow of his name. Political struggles, fear, and manipulations that would determine the future of the empire. When the great Genghis Khan released his weary body into eternity, his sons immediately began fighting for the legacy he left. But the question was not only about who would become his successor. Genghis Khan's legacy was not just about territory or titles. It was a code of war and cruelty, a power that did not recognize weakness. The real question became not only about land ownership, but the ways in which one could manipulate the deceased's legacy. Did Genghis Khan know that his death would mark the beginning of a ruthless struggle that would continue for many years after his departure? Some historians believe he had a strategy in place for his death. That whatever happened to his empire, even if he died, his will and fear would live on in his descendants. Could Genghis Khan's death have been a politically planned act, aimed at ensuring that his empire not only survived him, but continued to function as an ideological machine? The true aim of this conqueror wasn't just control over land. He was building his dynasty, and his death was just part of that dynastic game. After his death, the empire he left behind moved like a vast mechanism, But political disputes and manipulations left massive cracks at its foundation. His heirs not only continued his conquests, but also became embroiled in a fight for control, for the loyalty of the army and the wealth, for influence over those still loyal to the imperial bloodline. Was this a fight for succession, or had Genghis Khan simply become a tool in the hands of those eager to implement his policies for their own purposes? One of the most shocking aspects after Genghis Khan's death was his influence on his successors. Instead of leaving his legacy in peace, his sons entered into a battle for recognition as the rightful heirs. And could they really inherit an empire built on fear and manipulation? After his death, governing the land was not just a matter of politics, but at the very heart of the Genghis Khan dynasty, a battle for control began. Some historians argue that Genghis Khan's death was not just a natural end to his health, but a political game that turned death into another phase in the life of his empire. However, one cannot overlook the fact that manipulating his legacy became the main tool of political struggle for his sons and allies. Had Genghis Khan's empire not had such political and ideological foundations, it might have quickly disappeared after his death. But that did not happen. Could Genghis Khan's death have been just another tactical maneuver? What if I told you that after his death, other players on the political stage not only created his successor, but also a new machine that allowed them to manipulate territory and peoples? The empire wasn't just the great power he built. It was a mechanism that ran on his fear and glory, even when Genghis Khan could no longer directly control it. An interesting point is how his legacy remained a source of manipulation not only for his sons but also for his enemies, who sought to build their own empires while clinging to Genghis Khan's shadow. Could his rivals have used his death as an opportunity to achieve their own goals? Did they use his name as a political lever in their struggle for power and territories? After Genghis Khan's death, what remained was more than just the remnants of a grand empire. It became a battlefield where the struggle did not end with his passing. The legacy he left behind became the key to a new stage in the conflict. All his descendants sought to affirm their right to be the true heirs of Genghis Khan. But was their fight for power merely another continuation of the game he began during his lifetime? From the death of the great conqueror to the battle for an empire that had already gained its own strength, Genghis Khan continued to leave his mark in every battle, every political manipulation that took place after his departure. His legacy was not just his achievements, but a whole set of tools to preserve and expand his ideology. Even the death of this magnificent ruler did not mark the end of his empire. On the contrary, it only strengthened the ideas he had created and urged new generations to fight for power in his name. In the final hours of his life, Genghis Khan, once called the mightiest and most ruthless conqueror, felt not only physical agony, but a profound internal turmoil. His sick body refused to serve him, and all the strategies that had once given him strength were now futile. He lay in the darkness of his tent, wrapped in garments that absorbed sweat and blood. The doctors could no longer help him. They simply stood by, watching his physical collapse as shadows observing the end of a legend. Genghis Khan, who had once led battles and conquests with such courage and confidence, now felt fear. His final days were not just a struggle with illness, but a fight with himself. Yet even in this state, when his body was ravaged by disease, he tried to maintain control. The last moments in the great conqueror's chambers became a true spectacle of political manipulation, where even death became part of the game. Genghis Khan's death was not only a physical collapse but a symbolic act. In his final moments, while his body endured untold pain, his mind did not seem to give in. A paranoid fear was palpable, as if death itself were trying to break his spirit. The natural weaknesses of his body were seen as his greatest defeat. Although the empire stood on the verge of death along with him, in his soul, a hope still flickered that his legacy would remain unshaken. His last words became a farewell cry to battle. "My empire will not die with me." And while this could have been merely an emotional outburst of a mortally wounded warrior, these words became an emotional rallying cry for his heirs, embodying his political paranoia. and the final game he played with the world. In those moments, Genghis Khan was no longer just a warrior, he was a symbol of defiance. Even in the moment of death, he still saw his empire as alive. With every breath his wounded lung took, it seemed to him that the political struggle never ceased, and that even death would not be the end. The chambers in which the great conqueror died were enveloped in tense silence. Only the guards standing nearby involuntarily observed as his body departed this world. Time seemed powerless, but it couldn't strip Genghis Khan of the deep fear that now gripped him. What truly transpired in the final moments of his life? Though history has not preserved exact records, it can be assumed that Genghis Khan's death was not only the physical collapse of his body, but an internal struggle in which he faced his own terrifying experiences. His battered body left him no chance for a peaceful end. The battle for his empire and his personal invincibility left him no opportunity to relinquish his throne, even in death. Despite the unimaginable pain, he likely couldn't accept his death, just as he had never accepted defeat in battle. There was an internal resistance, and perhaps it was this fear for the empire he had built that prevented him from meeting his death calmly. Those around him could see that even on the brink of death, his face reflected the spirit of a fighter, and even the most profound fear, the fear of losing his legacy. But in these final moments, as the foundation of his empire faced deep collapse, he no longer had the strength to influence what was happening in the real world. Everything he had built and strived for was crumbling. Gradually, as with everything in this world, he disappeared from the political arena. From then on, only death became his final and greatest political act. After Genghis Khan's death, it seemed as if his power and influence remained in history. However, in reality, this was merely the beginning of a new phase of the battle for power that engulfed his entire empire. Those who remained after the great conqueror began to act not only in their own interests, but also to manipulate even Genghis Khan's legacy to secure their place on the throne. What initially seemed like a stable inheritance of a vast empire became a battlefield for political control. When Genghis Khan died, his children, as natural heirs, began making official statements proclaiming that he left this place as a god on earth. These words became a rallying cry for the unity of the empire and the greatness of its ruler. But within this magnificent narrative, intrigues were already brewing, which would prove fatal not only for his legacy, but for the very existence of Genghis Khan's empire. Power in the empire, though formally passed on, was anything but stable. On the surface, Genghis Khan left behind a vast empire with immense potential for his dynasty. But it was precisely the death of this great conqueror that marked the moment when the true battle for his legacy began. His sons and trusted advisors began defending their political interests, using every opportunity to manipulate the memories of the deceased ruler, attempting to present themselves as his rightful heirs. Each of them claimed the title of the best, as Genghis Khan had left several wills outlining how power was to be transferred after his death. Yet none of these wills became final, and even these documents were subject to manipulation, as each successor had their own ambitions. The dynastic split became the result of this ongoing political movement and manipulation, in which Genghis Khan could no longer participate, but his name remained a powerful political tool. What at first seemed like a blessing and the continuation of his great legacy turned into true political chaos. His heirs took turns claiming victories, profitable ideas, while Genghis Khan was elevated to the image of a god ruler, whose thoughts could not be disputed. However, within the empire, the processes of internal conflict had already begun. A significant role in this process was played by advisors and generals who saw their opportunity to seize power. One of the biggest aspects of manipulating Genghis Khan's legacy was how they even used his death to secure their place in history. Even after death, Genghis Khan became part of the battle for the throne. Those left behind tried to use every detail of his death to their advantage. The legend of Genghis Khan, which his children and advisors crafted, became not only a sacred narrative, but an important political instrument. As soon as Genghis Khan died, changes in power structures occurred, along with a struggle for control of the empire. Of course, each of the heirs considered themselves worthy successors, and another intrigue was added: who had the right to the throne according to the will, which turned out to be more complicated than initially believed. No one knew for certain what was in Genghis Khan's will, as history did not preserve the exact texts. However, this uncertainty led to rumors and manipulations, as each ruler in the empire tried to outsmart the others, pulling pieces of truth for themselves. Every part of this great legacy began to decay, and the battle for its management became not only political, but a real tragedy. Genghis Khan's heirs began to use even his death as a tool to create a myth around their claims. Looking at this from a modern perspective, one can see how this story reflects the political realities of the time, where death could be used not only to achieve desired outcomes, but also to leave a mark through strong manipulation. And though Genghis Khan was no longer alive, his death continued to play an important role in the political landscape of the world. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror. He was a living symbol of strength, capable of achieving incredible heights. His empire expanded faster than any other in history, and his strategic mind allowed him to control vast territories, from Mongolia to Europe. But even this great leader could not overcome his own death. And while Genghis Khan's death marked the end of his physical presence, it became the beginning of the end for the empire he had built. Could one imagine that the death of such a monumental figure would become such a decisive moment, changing the course of history? Some historians argue that even the death of this great leader was part of a larger political plan that continued after his last breath. His entire empire, created over decades of brutal conquests, was left without a clear strategy and with broken internal politics. Genghis Khan was not just a warrior, but a ruthless strategist who maintained the empire's unity through his authoritarianism and skillful use of power. But death shattered this balance and opened the way for internal struggles that would eventually disintegrate his empire. However, the most significant aspect was the cultural legacy that Genghis Khan left behind. His death, just like his life, had a tremendous impact on all the peoples he encountered, on all of Eurasia known at the time. At a time when great states were consumed with attempts at stabilization, Genghis Khan managed to ensure that the memory of him lived on in the minds of people for centuries to come. The propaganda surrounding his name was so strong that even death could not overshadow his importance in world history. What remained after him became the foundation of many cultures and traditions that various nations continue to use today. Genghis Khan's death allowed his significance as a symbol of strength and determination to be further emphasized. The empire he built, in a sense, became a metaphor for the empires that would emerge afterward. However, the collapse of his empire after his death created new political realities for the generations of rulers to follow. Genghis Khan was the first in history to make different parts of the world think about a new model of geopolitics. A model where the ruler's power and understanding of his strategy become decisive for the stability of the state. Yet, his death triggered a mechanism that tore apart this monolithic whole and initiated a series of new political and cultural conflicts. A particularly important aspect is the fact that Genghis Khan's death started a series of manipulations with his legacy. Had it not been for his sons and loyal generals, the empire could not have preserved its scale and influence on the world. Yet even they were unable to maintain such a vast state. As we see from history, Genghis Khan's death became the cause of political intrigue, which ultimately divided the Mongol Empire into several parts, each vying to be the chief heir to his power. The fact that Genghis Khan did not pass the empire on to a single heir, but divided it among his sons, also played a crucial role in how his death affected the subsequent political realities. The creation of such large-scale empires, where lands were divided among relatives, became part of the political process that began during his lifetime, and was likely his last political strategy. However, this strategy became a trap for his successors. The confrontation between them, the struggle for the throne and power, only scattered what remained of the great empire. Genghis Khan's empire eventually split into several autonomous states, but his legacy remained alive. Therefore, even Genghis Khan's death was not the end of this era. It simply marked a new phase in world politics, where the name of the great conqueror continued to be manipulated. Genghis Khan's cultural legacy became a part of the peoples who survived his death. It embodied not only political strength and military might, but also a deep understanding of power within a cultural context, where an empire could be created and dissolved at the will of one man. Genghis Khan's death became both the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, in which people all over the world began to realize that not every leader could retain power in the way he had. Although the death of Genghis Khan and the subsequent collapse of his empire did not immediately alter the world's political landscape, the changes they triggered were significant. As a result, his death became a moment that not only impacted the political terrain, but also altered the course of development for many countries and peoples, laying the groundwork for new conflicts and agreements. His death, while marking the end of an era, was actually the beginning of something new that would shape the fate of many generations to come. Was Genghis Khan's death truly natural? Or was it part of yet another grand strategy planned with the same precision he used to conquer continents? How many manipulations, intrigues, and dark forces were behind his final days? We may never know the exact truth, but one thing remains undeniable. The death of this great leader not only shattered his empire, but also marked the beginning of a new era in history, one that changed the world's political map for centuries to come. These questions remain a mystery. They continue to haunt historians and political scientists, prompting even the most unlikely theories about the death of the great conqueror. Perhaps we will never fully understand how his death became such a turning point in history. Maybe his empire was intentionally divided even before his death, and maybe all these events were part of a plan that forced people, political leaders, and even states to play by his rules, even after he left this world. What we do know for sure is that Genghis Khan's empire did not fall apart immediately. It existed for several more decades, though without the unity he had managed to maintain during his life. His sons, his generals, and even the peoples who had become part of his empire continued to act in his shadow, trying to preserve the monolithic strength he had created. After his death, a new political reality emerged, where the quest for power forced former allies to become enemies, and the conflicts in the East grew even more brutal. Yet even Genghis Khan's death raised many questions. Why was his body not found for so long? Why was there no official funeral ceremony? And ultimately, what do we really know about his final days? Isn't this one of the mysteries that makes his death not just the physical end of a great ruler, but one of the greatest mysteries in world history? Now, when we look at the legacy of Genghis Khan, with his conquests and wars, it seems that his death is just one part of a much larger game, where every move, every decision has consequences for future generations. And despite the numerous theories, can we call this death simply a coincidence? Or was it something more? Something Genghis Khan himself might have considered his final manipulation in the game for power and control. Perhaps assassinations, intrigues, and political manipulations leave no room for heroic deaths. Maybe even Genghis Khan's death was not just the physical end of a great conqueror, but part of an even grander story. Perhaps we need to search for answers not in how he died, but in why this moment became so important for world history, and how we can view it through the lens of modern political strategies. Indeed, the world has changed, and can we say that today, amidst geopolitical changes and the struggle for resources, politicians do not manipulate the bodies of their opponents even after their death? And could the death of Genghis Khan serve as a warning for us about the role of death's interpretation in political games, and about how even those who are no longer with us can leave an imprint on our history much larger than we think? Our history is filled with such moments, and the death of Genghis Khan is just one of the greatest mysteries that continues to influence our world. Considering all this, it is impossible not to ask ourselves, What do we really know about the death of those who were once the most powerful people on Earth?